They're not rushing to sit at the right line of sight, I notice.
Fine. Well, good morning, everyone. This morning, the Constitution Committee is hearing evidence into its inquiry into the governance of the Union, consultation, cooperation and legislative consent. And we are hearing evidence from the Right Honourable Alister Jack MP, Secretary of State for Scotland, the Right Honourable David Davis MP, Secretary of State for Wales, and Lord Kane, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State at the Northern Ireland Office. So, good morning, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. And I wanted to say I'm particularly grateful for the coordination of your diaries so that you could all come. That's really helpful to us to get the cross picture. And I realise that's compliments to the diary secretaries that they achieve that in response to our request. So very grateful to that. I know that each of you would like to make a brief opening statement, which we'll go to. We obviously have a series of questions, and hopefully you've had an indication of the areas we're interested in. But maybe I could invite you to make your opening comments. I don't know who would like to open first.
We drew lots, Chair, and I'm going first.
Right.
Okay. So good morning, committee. Good morning, Chair, and thank you for your invitation to all of us to give evidence to your committee. I wanted just to start by saying that devolution is broadly working as intended, and that's despite what is a very testing circumstance that we've experienced in Scotland over the last 17 years. And to that, we can't ignore the political realities. We have a UK government supportive of devolution and an SNP-led Scottish government that opposes devolution, a nationalist administration whose political interests are not served by devolution succeeding. So, of course, there have been tensions between Scotland's two governments. But that friction is not evidence of devolution failing. In fact, the evidence shows that the devolution settlement has proved sufficiently flexible to accommodate fundamental political differences. A good example of that is the operation of the Sewell Convention, which I know is part of your inquiry. Since the beginning of devolution, UK governments have legislated in devolved policy areas with the consent of the Scottish Parliament more than 200 times. There have only been 10 occasions when the UK government has legislated without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. On each occasion, that was critical for the whole of the United Kingdom, and for example, it was to deliver Brexit or to implement the valuable trade deals we've done with Australia and New Zealand. And we've only done so after engaging with the Scottish Government, after hearing their concerns and offering to make changes to the legislation. Scottish Government ministers have claimed that legislating without consent has undermined devolution, and this has prompted questions about whether the Sewell Convention should be made legally binding. My own view, after 5 years of experience in this role, is that would be a profound mistake. It would fundamentally alter the devolution settlement, and it would gravely weaken the Union by preventing the UK Parliament from legislating on behalf of the whole country where necessary. The Sewell Convention was never intended to give devolved administrations a veto over UK-wide legislation, and the consequences of allowing one are not difficult to imagine. Because since the start of devolution, the UK government has also approved more than 200 Section 104 orders. Those are where laws are passed at Holyrood, and then it requires legislation to be changed on UK law, changes to UK law. We've done so recently, even where we've disagreed with the basis of the Scottish Government's legislation. And finally, Chair, I'd like to highlight how in recent years we've strengthened devolution by transferring powers from Brussels to Edinburgh, while agreeing new UK-wide approaches to regulation through our Common Frameworks programme. This has been underpinned by the UK Internal Market Act, which protects cross-border trade, which also has allowed us to deliver real devolution. So we've taken powers to spend money directly in Scotland, practicing real devolution with local authorities, and we've also sought to protect the internal market, which is 60% of Scotland's trade is with the rest of the UK. It's by far our biggest market. So, Chair, I'll sum up. Just thank you very much for allowing me to say a few opening words, and I look forward to answering your committee's questions.
Thank you. I mean, on the Sewell Convention, you're right, we're going to come on to that, and I don't want to open up a debate on that. But, of course, I note your point about only 10 occasions, but, of course, one of the things we're interested in is the extent to which delegated legislation is now also being used to intervene in odd matters, but we can come to that when we get there. Would your colleagues like to make a statement, or we settling on the...
Well, may I just add a few words, Baroness,
Yeah.
straight to what my colleague, Secretary of State for Scotland, said. Obviously, I agree with all of that. I would just add that the Welsh devolution settlement is different and in some ways more complex, which is a reflection of the history, geography, culture of Wales, and the fact that there's been a single legal jurisdiction of England and Wales, which has been the case since, I think, 1536. And devolution has meant that there's now an interaction between the reserved justice system and the Senedd and the Welsh Government's devolved powers. Devolved and reserved bodies should work collaboratively together as partners, and as Secretary of State, I'm always keen to try and make sure that that happens. And I'm very pleased that the justice system continues to work well in Wales. However, it is because of the porosity of the border that I have always been clear that we need to operate within the framework of a strong, stable United Kingdom. We need to ensure that we're respectful of devolved matters, and we also hope and I'm sure that the Welsh Government will be respectful of reserved matters. Cross-border issues can be addressed by the United Kingdom Government working with the Welsh Government where appropriate. I meet regularly with Welsh ministers outside and inside of formal structures, and I will always continue to encourage them to work constructively with us for the benefit of all in Wales. And of course we do on many issues, which I can elaborate on later on in this session. Discussions can be political in nature. At times there is no secret about the fact that there can be tensions due to the fact we have a Conservative government in Westminster and a Labour government in Wales. But I like to think and believe that on issues where we're all in agreement, such as the importance of encouraging investment, jobs, the growth deals, the work that's going on around Tata, for example, there's a lot of collaborative working. I disagree very strongly with powers, the calls for more powers to be transferred to the Welsh Government. I believe that ministers in Cardiff Bay should be completely focused on delivering for the people of Wales and not sidetracked by endless constitutional debates. I believe that the current arrangements broadly work well and benefit from the flexibility which a statutory system could not provide. Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Kane.
Thank you very much to the committee for the invitation to attend today's session and to represent the Northern Ireland office. I should start by saying that Northern Ireland remains a very highly valued part of the United Kingdom, and this government is strongly committed to safeguarding and strengthening its place within our union, as set out in the recent command paper which led to the restoration of devolved government in February after 2 years of not functioning. It is important to highlight the uniqueness of the devolution settlement in Northern Ireland, where the context and I would say dynamic of how it works, and as a result the relationship with the UK government is often quite different to that in Scotland and Wales. As the committee is fully aware, the devolved institutions at Stormont are the product of many years of negotiation that culminated in the 1998 Belfast Agreement, which helped to bring an end to a period that had claimed over 3,500 lives. It is therefore not just about delivering good governance for the people of Northern Ireland, but about delivering peace, stability and prosperity in which both major traditions are properly and fairly represented and have a stake in society, even though their aspirations are fundamentally different. As a result, unlike in Scotland and Wales, Northern Ireland has a mandatory coalition which depends on cooperation between the two largest parties representing majorities of unionism and nationalism, and with most important legislation having to be passed on a cross-community basis. Also, as is evident from recent years, if one party, major party, pulls out of the executive, then the system ceases to function. That is, of course, unlike most systems anywhere else in the world, where if the government falls, another one takes its place. A big preoccupation of the UK government since 1998 has therefore been to support stability, to prevent the institutions falling over, and in circumstances where they have, put them back together. And I speak as somebody who's been intimately involved in both trying to prevent them falling over and putting them back together. Of course, it is our fervent hope that the latest restoration will be sustainable and durable, and so far the evidence is that the executive is working well with a very good relationship between the First and Deputy First Ministers, which is absolutely crucial to the functioning of the whole system. But it does also require a high level of regular engagement between the UK government and the Northern Ireland Executive, not just the First and Deputy First Ministers, but the other Executive Ministers as well, if we are to deliver, to use the mantra that I've been deploying for many years, a Northern Ireland where politics works, the economy grows and society is more united and strong. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for those statements. I mean, they slightly anticipate some of the questions that we have. But if I could open, because one of the reasons we were quite keen to be, all of you, particularly all of you together, is to help us understand more the role of the territorial departments in both maintaining and improving the relationships between the UK government and the governments of the devolved nations, because I don't think we're terribly clear on the specific role of the territorial department. So perhaps you could, maybe Mr. Jack, you can explain how you contribute through that role and what it is.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, I'd start by saying that it's not just ministers, it's officials, and it's a lot of meetings, it's a lot of discourse. I think in 2022 it was 270 meetings took place. And I would also say that what we do, so as ministers, what we do is we obviously have the structure. So we have the interministerial group committees, and that's important. And we also have independently direct contact with our devolved administrations. In my case, it's the things that are relevant there would be, for instance, free ports. There's been a lot of work done on free ports, on the city and region growth deals. That's been an ongoing piece of work that's been very successful. There's the levelling up funds and how we do all that. There's been a huge amount of work going on across government, and that totals some £3 billion in investment from the UK government directly into Scotland. So it's not just dealing with the Scottish government, but we're dealing with local authorities as well. And that's a good thing, because it means that we have we have the relevance of two governments again in Scotland, and we hadn't had that for 40 years. I mean, I've been very keen to press ministers from all departments to go, Whitehall departments, to go to Scotland. And the Scotland office provides the logistic support for that, and our press department help, the media department, civil servants this is, get the ministers fit for dealing with the Scottish press. It's a very different Scottish press. So they're able to do all of that in that role. And that takes me into officials. So what officials are doing day in, day out, they're having the meetings behind the scenes, both as one GB civil service, if you like, with Scottish government officials, but they're also having the meetings within Whitehall, across Whitehall departments, to make sure legislation that's coming up is carefully checked and bad things don't happen, if I can put it that way. We don't make mistakes. The Whitehall departments understand the devolution settlement. So our role is twofold. It's one, dealing with the Scottish government and dealing with local authorities, but also dealing with Whitehall departments. And the last thing I'd say on this, before I know the Secretary of State for Wales wants to come in, but the last thing I would say on this is that we have a Delivering for Scotland. I have a Delivering for Scotland board. So every quarter, I chair a meeting with the senior civil servants in every department across Whitehall, and we talk about what they're doing to strengthen the United Kingdom, to strengthen the Union, and we talk through the issues that they have coming up, the contact they're having with the Scottish Government, and that our lead non-exec director attends that, the director of the Scotland office attends it, I chair it, and as I say, every Whitehall department is represented. The meeting lasts for a number of hours, but we drill down, we have an action list, we come back, we focus. So again, we're coordinating that, and we're able to help them with problems they have or things they don't maybe understand around the devolution settlement, which I see myself as a protector of.
Can you give us an example, a sort of hard evidence example of where the territorial department has brought its influence to bear on changing what have may been the initial cut on a government view on a policy so we can understand how you're exercising that influence.
In terms of, say, what the Scottish Government's policy is, or UK government policy?
So when you're exercising this role of ensuring the Scottish perspective on a UK policy is taken into account, or the impact of it.
Yeah, so it's obviously ensuring that the devolution settlement is respected. That's critical. And it's looking at specific areas where Scotland has maybe does things differently. I mean, the recent one was the most recent example, I think, is the Horizon Bill, the Postmasters Bill, where the Scottish Government was saying one thing, but the Lord Advocate, who's a member of the Scottish Government, but part of that to one side, was saying a different thing. And we, what I did with DBT was work to ensure that what the Lord Advocate wanted to deliver was delivered in that bill. That was important because the Scottish Government, there was no doubt there was confusion amongst them on what they wanted, but the reality was that the postmasters, the convictions had been done in England in the majority, but not entirely, by the Post Office. In Scotland, they'd been done by the Crown Office. So it wasn't the Director of Public Prosecutions, and it wasn't in England. It was differently done in Scotland by the Crown Office. And to that end, they wanted to unpick, the Lord Advocate wanted to unpick the convictions because some of the convictions may have overlapped with prosecutions that had been done in England by DWP, but in Scotland had been done by the Crown Office, or it may have been money laundering overlaps and things like that. So she wanted to carefully unpick that, and I worked hard to get DBT to the place where they understood that we should respect what the law officers in Scotland wanted to do, so that they could then deal with the justice issues correctly.
Good example. Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you very much indeed, Baroness Drake. I mean, obviously, my colleague has given the high-level answer, but you're searching for examples. So I will always obviously say, when asked what I do in a nutshell, our role is to represent Wales around the cabinet table. You would then justifiably say, well, give some examples of how you've done that and how that has worked out in practice. So for actual examples, one that is very relevant at the moment is the development of the floating offshore wind industry in the Celtic Sea off the coast of South Wales. That has been far from straightforward. It is going along at a pace at the moment, but in order to enable us to have got to where we are at the moment with an auction round currently taking place, I've had to hold numerous meetings with Crown Estates and with a variety of government departments, DEFRA, DFT, with the Crown Estates itself, of course, with DESNES, and with at least one other government department as well, each of whom have had problems or issues that required resolving, some of which seem fairly difficult to resolve, but have been resolved. Because frankly, because I'm a cabinet minister and a member of government, I'm able, rightly, to go and see ministers in those departments whenever I need to. And I'm not, by the way, for 1 minute suggesting that I've played anything other than a small role in helping us to get to where we have done. But with the support of many people in the Wales office, we have encouraged those departments to swiftly deal with the problems that have been presented. And so that is, if you like, an absolute live example of where the office has been very good for the development of an important industry in Wales. And obviously has had first and foremost in supporting the proposal to build an electric arc furnace which will save 5,000 jobs. And secondly, to acknowledge fully the enormous impact that 2,800 job losses will have in a town like Port Talbot, and to be working to make sure that other government departments are there stepping up, to make sure we support anyone who loses their job, to make sure that there is training available to get people into other jobs, to make sure that DLUC and Treasury are coming up with the money, £80 million so far, to support that training, to support infrastructure improvements, to make sure that Port Talbot can benefit from the Towns Fund, to be chasing up other departments to make sure that free port status is allocated quickly and smoothly to Port Talbot so they can look for other industries coming in. It's been a very important piece of work that is ongoing, and it requires me to be able to get into the door of numerous government departments around Whitehall and beyond it to support the town and the community. Those are just 2 examples.
Thank you. Looking, Northern Ireland is slightly different, and we've got some specific questions coming up on Northern Ireland, but is there anything you particularly wanted to add?
Just very briefly, my mind goes back to 2010, shortly after the devolution of policing and justice, and I think it's fair to say that that was such a big part of what the Northern Ireland Office did at the time, that in the aftermath of that final piece of the devolution jigsaw, if you like, there was uncertainty as what the precise role of the department was, and at the time the officials really would say to us, well, it's as David alluded to in Wales, it's about supporting Northern Ireland's interests around the UK cabinet table, etc., etc. Yeah, we very quickly came to the conclusion that wasn't enough, and actually a large part of what we had to do was represent UK government interests as well in Northern Ireland, so it's a two-way street. As part of that, a large element is ensuring that the various political agreements that have been made over the years, going back to 1998, St Andrews and subsequent, are properly and faithfully implemented, and obviously most recently the command paper commitments that were produced in February. We also work very closely with the executive on issues like economic prosperity. As in Scotland, there are city and regional growth deals in which UK government and NIE are very, very closely involved in partnership. And also in doing what we can jointly to encourage inward investment into Northern Ireland. So the devolved institutions, the executive has Invest Northern Ireland, we've got DBT, we're not in competition, we try and complement each other in trying to secure overseas investment. Just briefly on an area, to answer your question about an area where we've influenced government policy in a devolved area. Actually, it's the post office, but actually in a different direction to the one which Alister's department went. You'll know the original proposal was that the legislation extended only to England and Wales. And as a result of conversations between the Northern Ireland Office, the Northern Ireland Executive and DBT, amendments were passed last week or the week before to ensure that Northern Ireland was included. So that's just a good and concrete example of where the relationship between the UK government and in particular the Northern Ireland Office and the Northern Ireland Executive have resulted in UK government policy changing.
Thank you. Staying with the role of the Territorial Department, I've got several supplementary questions my colleagues would like to ask. Baroness Goldie.
Yes, thank you very much for these comments. I think it's extremely helpful, illuminating for the committee. I was very struck with what was sewn in amongst the fabric you were describing, and that's relationships, and maybe you specifically, Mr. Davis, mentioned them. So I'm interested to understand, what does engagement with devolved ministers look like? Is there a diaried schedule, or is it very much on an issue-by-issue basis?
Well, obviously, Baroness Goldie, there are formal mechanisms for meeting with ministers from devolved administrations. There are the IMGs, for example. But on a day-to-day basis, I meet with ministers regularly. For example, I made reference to Tata Steel. The UK government has set up a transition board to support the people and community of Port Talbot. Now, although it is actually UK government who have funded this with £80 million and an additional promise of 20 million from Tata, I made it very clear it's really, really important that we show a positive attitude towards working with the Welsh government, and therefore I suggested that we would want a Welsh Government minister to sit on that board and be a deputy chair of that board. And so that is what has happened. The Economic Development Minister, who is now the First Minister, sat for the first, I think, 4 meetings, and then his position was taken by the new Economic Development Minister, Jeremy Miles. So I will sit as closely with them as I am with Mr. Jack at the moment, and I can show you the conversations and the formal and informal are very positive, because we're all on the same page in wanting to support the people and community of Port Talbot.
That's very helpful. And obviously, as the Territorial Secretary of State, you will often be in Wales dealing with reserved issues for which you have a a cabinet responsibility. When that happens, I mean, is there any attempt to engage with devolved ministers who may be interested or want to understand better what the impact of these reserve policies may be, or do you just do your own thing in Wales?
Well, obviously, if to take actual examples, if I were visiting the armed forces is clearly a reserve matter. If I were visiting an armed force base, I wouldn't necessarily have any contact with anyone in Welsh Government. But having said that, as a matter of fact, the Welsh Government have appointed a minister to have oversight of veterans, and I recall now that I actually did meet her the last time I visited Brecon Barracks, which is fine. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily expect a Welsh Government minister to be present if I'm conducting a visit relating completely to reserve matters, but I certainly wouldn't have any objection if they were there. It's probably a case-by-case basis. When we're dealing with matters that cross over, then clearly we will be informing and hoping to work with Welsh Government ministers.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And Mr. Jack, very similar questions. Again, you've given a very full description of the extensive engagement you have. And sort of with that, I mean, do you have a sort of diary schedule to meet ministers in the devolved government in Scotland, or is it, as an issue demands it, you will engage with the appropriate minister?
It's both.
Right.
So there is a structure, and then there are issues that require conversations, either in person or on Zoom or on the telephone, but it's both. All those things are done, obviously, with the civil service present, so we keep everything on we keep it formal, but it's informal in its need, depending on as issues arrive. I mean, a recent example, not dissimilar to what Secretary of State for Wales is referring to, has been the task force set up for Grangemouth. But following Brexit, we had a seafood task force that operated very well out of the Scotland office, chaired by David, the Minister for Bamford, the Minister for Fisheries, within our, if you like, portfolio within the Scotland office. David Ducat, the MP for Bamford Buchan, chaired that. And there have been a number of examples where that's worked very well.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And Lord Kane, I imagine that with the recency of the establishment of the executive in Northern Ireland, you're now in a new sort of level of engagement. So very briefly, if you can explain how you strike up relationships.
I mean, like Alister, it's driven by both diary scheduling and events as they come up, obviously. I mean, our hope now is that with a restored executive, we can actually build a much more structured relationship than we've had over the past few years. Secretary of State is engaging in regular meetings with First and Deputy First Ministers. I did a school opening with the First and Deputy First Ministers, the Finance Minister and the Education Minister a few weeks ago, in February. And that's an interesting example of where there's a crossover between the devolved side and the UK government, because the education is devolved in Northern Ireland, of course, but there are commitments in the Fresh Start Agreement from 2015 for the UK government to provide funding for integrated education. So we all have a stake. And so I opened a school in Limavady, shared education campus, only a few weeks ago, where it was UK government funded along with Northern Ireland executive money. So that's just a good example of how we want to collaborate more closely. And I've got meetings coming up with the Health Minister, the Communities Minister, and the Education Minister. So there will obviously be, if there's a sort of a threat of a plant closure or a factory closure, that will necessitate cooperation and consultation, as and when things come up. But we are determined to try and get a much more structured relationship in place than has necessarily been the case over the past few years.
Well, thank you all very much. That's been extremely helpful.
Thank you. I'm going to call in Barrister Andrews. I'm just sort of managing time. I'm conscious if we have 3 answers to every question, we're not going to get through. So if someone answering a question captures the spirit of what you feel, maybe you can indicate that and that can steer me to Moving on. Baroness Andrews, I think we're on to resourcing now. Baroness Andrews, you had a question.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just follow up one point, actually, that's come out so far?
Then take your resource question.
Yes, absolutely. When you, good morning, gentlemen, and it's really for Mr. Jack and Mr. Davis, when you were talking about your capacity to engage with policy as it's coming through, as it were, you were talking about the very positive aspects in which you can influence and make a difference. And you mentioned the internal market, of course. And the internal market was not a happy ship in the sense that there was a lot of concern from Wales and Scotland about the lack of engagement in the beginning. And the bill itself, actually, did not go through the consent procedures. And there was a relationship with the common frameworks, which looked at first as if it would have a very negative impact on the operation of frameworks and the resolution of disputes. I'm just wondering, in that mix, what role you were able to play, actually, to maybe interpret one side to the other, or take a position which made it easier to find a compromise, as was eventually found when the bill went through this House.
Well, we had meetings, regular meetings with the devolved administrations, and frameworks, you're absolutely right, were dragging. And I remember quite near to the end of the Brexit process, I think we only had 3 agreed, and we were aiming for 32 from memory. And we knew from the then minister in Scotland, Mike Russell, that he had said very clearly there would be no cooperation over Brexit. There'd be no LCMs, and there weren't, by the way, any LCMs on Brexit. And of course, and this is a very important point, but had we not been the sovereign parliament and able to legislate without LCMs, we would have had a hard Brexit, because that is a fact. I mean, that is we had a timeline, we had a deadline, and we were very keen to get the legislation in place to ensure we didn't have a hard Brexit, and that would have been the outcome had we not taken the decisions we took. And we did put into the UKIM bill spending powers, as you know, and we also put in protections that respected the single market within the United Kingdom. And I said earlier that it's 60% of Scotland's trade. I mean, the Scottish Government talk about the EU being their biggest market. It is a big market, but it's not by trade their biggest market. 20% of Scotland's trade is with the EU. 20% of Scotland's trade is with the rest of the world. 60% of Scotland's trade is within the United Kingdom, and it's critically important we protected that. And so the EU's single market principles of non-discrimination and mutual recognition, we had to enforce those within the UKIM bill, so those were respected, because that then allowed the Scottish Government, in the areas that were devolved, where they wanted to differentiate, as Mike Russell said they would, and follow EU legislation, not UK government legislation, and that respecting devolution is what they can do. They could do that, but remembering that traders within the United Kingdom were protected by those principles, as they are within the EU, of mutual recognition and non-discrimination. So we had to, the UK Internal Market Act did upset them, but it upset them because it solved the problems that got us over the finishing line.
But did you have a very quick?
Yes,
absolutely. Sure. Did you play a?
Played a very significant role in that. I wasn't going to boast, but there were a number of things that were put in there that I put in there to get us where we had to get to. But I was being, typically modest.
Right, thank you. I will move on to the resource question, because we have had evidence actually suggests that, and this is as long as a piece of string, that had you more resource, you'd have more capacity, you'd be taken as more seriously, you'd have more civil servants able to do more things.
I would say I think the delay was, I was the sort of Prime Minister's Union advisor during the UKIM bill was the former
in
Luke Graham.
But
in general, I worked quite closely with Luke Graham, who was in number 10 at the time, dealing with these things, and we knew that we knew there was a deadline coming, but we were hoping that the Scottish Government, I remember calling out the lack of engagement and frameworks in one of these interministerial government meetings and saying, come on, let's get going with them. And I think the next meeting we'd gone from 3 to 8. We were still a long way short. But the pressure had to be built, and we delayed pushing the UKIM legislation too hard too early on, because we hoped the other thing, that within the civil service, knowing civil servants speak to each other, we hoped the message might get through to the ministers and the Scottish Government that we meant business. And I think it did, probably towards the end. An awful lot of what happens in government happens with officials telling officials what ministers are thinking, without ministers maybe realising that. I've been around a long time now, I know how it works.
Absolutely.
So you feed your thinking to your officials, knowing quietly that they will then press it to officials in the devolved administration, who will then press ministers to take decisions. And that was part of an iterative process without us sort of throwing our weight about.
Well, what I was planning to ask actually was a more general question.
Yeah, no, what we want to particularly, given there's going to be a lot of horizon scanning across government departments in order to know when you need to input the Scottish or Welsh or Northern Ireland interest. Probably Northern Ireland is slightly different, but have you got the resources? Because when you look at the resources, we say with those resources, can you really do that horizon scanning job and seize the moment?
Yes, so we have, I go back to my Delivering for Scotland board. So we, I mean, I think as territorial departments, we punch above our weight in what we achieve. I think we have more relevance since we left the EU, because there's a lot of interaction with local authorities across the devolved administrations as well as with the devolved administrations themselves. And the Delivering for Scotland board, where we have those, I mean, I say it's quarterly, we may make it every 2 months going forward. They've been very effective in dealing with Whitehall departments, you know, holding them to account, advising them, directing them, putting things in or out of legislation. You know, it's an ongoing process, and as I say, that has been very effective, because we bring knowledge of the issues, both legal and policy-wise, that those Whitehall departments wouldn't necessarily have.
Well,
thank you, Baroness Drake. May I say to Baroness Andrews, just for 2 things very quickly. First of all, on the issue of resources, on money. Of course, I'm sure if I were given more money, I'd find ways to spend it, no doubt, as most ministers could. But I actually feel that we have perfectly adequate resources to do the job that we need to do, and it may be because I'm also very pleased to say we seem to have a very high quality of officials and civil servants working in the Wales office who clearly have the interests of Wales very much at heart. On your other question, if I may just go back slightly, because I hope we're not going to completely skirt over this. You mentioned the concerns about UKIM. May I say in a more general sort of way, it is important that the United Kingdom government is able to legislate for the whole of the United Kingdom on all reserved matters, and clearly Brexit and the aftermath was a reserved matter. And what would not be good for the Union would be if one of the devolved administrations could use could sort of block things from being done that clearly were reserved. So, for example, it would have been absolutely wrong if Wales or Scotland had decided to block trade deals or block UKIM because they didn't like Brexit. And as I'm sure we're probably on slightly different sides of the Brexit argument, but Wales voted for Brexit. The United Kingdom voted for Brexit. And I always found it very ironic that Welsh Government ministers were trying to prevent a process which the people of Wales had voted for, just as people voted for the Senedd itself, which gave them their mandate to do that. I didn't vote for devolution myself, but I fully respect the fact that the people of Wales have done so twice now, and therefore I respect the process and the importance of working with the Senedd. But isn't it interesting that if we, for example, made SUEL mandatory, you know, we had a sort of statutory duty to not to legislate if we can get LCMs, we could have a situation hypothetically in years to come where if people voted again in a referendum to rejoin the European Union, but if one of the devolved administrations didn't like the idea much, then they could theoretically put a block on that happening. And that, of course, is also something that would be completely wrong. So I think we have to be careful about respecting the right of the DAs to legislate in devolved areas, but not to give them a sort of veto on the UK, United Kingdom government from legislating in areas that are reserved.
We're coming on to Saul, but I want to pick up another point because I'm conscious I know what's coming on track that we also need to cover. And I want to bring in Lord Fawkes. I'm not surprised that Mr. Jack would expect a question from Lord.
Oh, I'd be delighted.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll follow up something you said. As you know, I've not been uncritical of the Scottish Government. However, you said that you have meetings across Whitehall. Now, I've come across a feeling of, or a sense that there are civil servants in Whitehall who are maybe ignorant about devolution. There are some that are even hostile towards devolution because they've lost some of their powers. Is there any way we could strengthen your role as a departmental office to help to get rid of that ignorance and that hostility?
I think as time goes on, that is changing. And I do recognise what you say, but I mean, I do think that the UKIM Act has changed things dramatically because it has given powers back to Whitehall that they'd ceded to Brussels, and there may have been some hostility around that for quite a long time as well. And but it is one civil service within Great Britain, and what I think we should have more of is interaction between the civil service in Scotland and Westminster, and I think that may that has slowed up a lot under the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government, and it's something I have been pressing very hard for, and we have actually got some policies now coming in place to move civil servants around more, to have more shadowing, to have better experience both north and south of the border.
I wonder therefore why Westminster, Whitehall, didn't come in earlier to say to the Scottish Government, your deposit return scheme does not fit in with the United Kingdom policy, and stop Lorna Slater and the Scottish Government wasting hundreds of millions of pounds. You could have stepped in a lot earlier.
For which they're now being sued.
Yeah, but why didn't you step in earlier?
Well, so that's a very fair challenge. I stepped in. So I'll give you. If I take you back a step, I stepped in earlier on UNCRC with, I think, advice from the noble Lord Keane at the time, running into that period, who was the Advocate General for Scotland. But clauses 6 and 19 to 21, we could see from a distance out from 2020 into March 2021 when I wrote the letter to the now First Minister, John Swinney, received the letter. And his response to receiving my letter, which solved his problems, if you like, on the advice I had, was to hold it up and say that I'd written a menacing letter. And then for the First Minister to then put out on the airwaves, Nicola Sturgeon being First Minister at the time, that I was morally repugnant, only for us to end up in the Supreme Court after the Section 33 order and for us to win hands down. So what happened with the deposit return scheme was I was very clear in interministerial government meetings from quite an early stage that they would require an exclusion from the UK Internal Market Act. I was very clear about that. Others thought differently. But, why was I clear? I was clear because over 1,000 businesses thought differently, and clearly they thought differently. But over 1,000 Scottish businesses had written to me with their concerns. We've never had, the Scotland office has never had a campaign like that before. And I won't go through the 5 sticking points, but the 5 sticking points remain today as they did then, why the system has got serious flaws. And just to say, I was very clear, knowing that 85% of the glass they wanted to include in their scheme came from other parts of the UK or Europe, knowing there were labelling issues, knowing, we did actually, and I sat in the meeting and I did offer them an exclusion based on the four of the 5 issues that needed to be addressed. Glass was excluded, that was the 5th one, but the other 4 issues about the scheme working seamlessly across the UK, standardised labelling, standardised pricing, the idea you got on the train in Glasgow, having bought 6 cans of lager and paid 20 pence a can deposit, and you got to London and you got 10 pence back per can, that wasn't going to go down too well, or vice versa. So all those things were in there, and they didn't like the terms. So we did offer an exclusion. They knew from a long distance out, Lord Folks, they knew from a long distance out that this But they just thought if they kept going, I would back down.
Okay.
Okay? And that was no different with they never believed I would do a Section 35 on the gender recognition. And they didn't believe I would take them to court on UNCRC and the Section 33. So it's this idea that they would sail on and I would roll over and not stand my ground. And that was their misjudgment.
You were well. I support you in standing your ground, and you did well. David mentioned legislating for the whole of the United Kingdom on reserved areas. Can I ask you, therefore, on energy? Energy is a reserved area. The Scottish Government have said we don't want any nuclear power stations in Scotland, yet they're prepared to take electricity generated by nuclear power stations in England. Why can't the United Kingdom government say we want a nuclear power station in Scotland? And I know for a fact that everyone around Torness, including local people, are keen to see Torness, a new Torness. So why can't you step in? It's a reserved area.
So on the small nuclear reactors, I have asked the Energy Minister to plan for one in Scotland.
Good.
And because I believe in 2026 we'll see a unionist regime again in Holyrood, and then we'll move forward on that matter.
Good.
So that's my view. With the timescale of what's in front of us, I don't see any point having a great fight over it. I think it was a mistake, and this, as a committee, you may want to think about a review into 25 years of devolution. I don't think everything was right. The committee structure, I don't think, was right. I think bad devolution is not a bad thing. Where it's failed is bad governance.
Yes.
In the last 17 years, we've got poorer health service, we've got failing education standards, we've got a diabolical ferry service to the islands, we've got higher drug deaths. These things are down to governance, not devolution. Let's be clear about that.
Exactly, and it is the efficiency of the governance structure around the devolution settlement that the Constitution Committee's interest is in.
But those are very helpful replies. Thank you.
But you could look further into the committee structure, because the knowledge and wisdom in this place could be used to help review. I've often thought the better review of legislation in Scotland could be one of the things we could improve upon, and some sort of grand committee in this House helping to scrutinise and improve legislation would be a very good thing, because I'm not alone in saying the committee structure in scrutinising legislation in Scotland has clearly been one of the failings.
Well, I think Lord Strathclyde might take us to that point later, or in part to that point. But just to finish this off, I mean, in terms of your respective roles as Secretary of State for Wales and Secretary of State for Scotland, I'm not posing this question to Northern Ireland at the moment, and what one change would you particularly like to see in terms of your responsibility or access to improve Whitehall's consideration of the Welsh or Scottish dimension?
I don't actually. I have given this some thought, not in discussions we've had, and I'm very content with where we are. I'm stepping down at the general election, but if I was continuing in this role, the only thing I would change in the new world we live in post-Brexit is to make certainly Wales and Scotland spending departments again. At the moment, we work with other departments on our spending, but I think the time has come now to go back to where we were pre-joining the EU. This is not a pre-devolution thing. This is a pre-EU thing, and for structural funds to be spent by the territorial offices.
Sorry, can I just come in very briefly on the original question? I mean, back in 2010, I used to think that on a bad day, Whitehall would think about England. On a better day, it would think about Great Britain. And on a good day, occasionally think about the United Kingdom.
Fair point.
All I can say is I think over the past number of years, it has got a lot better. And from a Northern Ireland perspective, this might be partly because of the number of political agreements that we've had to enter into, which have engaged other government departments and the rest of Whitehall. But it has improved significantly. We are much more on the radar than we were 10, 15 years ago. and there are renewed commitments in the Safeguarding the Union command paper to increase cooperation between the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the Home Civil Service on things like public service transformation. So it has improved.
Do you want to make a final?
Well, simply to echo entirely what Secretary of State Scotland said about making the TO spending departments, but we obviously work very closely with DLUC at the moment, but it would be, I think, a useful reform. I wanted to answer one other question about attitude of civil servants and officials beyond the TOs. I have encountered ignorance, but it was never hostility. I've never encountered hostility towards devolution, but occasionally I've had to, through officials, point out the realities of devolution, and I think things have got a lot better over the 4 years or so I've been a minister. And I think I had something else, but I haven't got it in front of me, so I'll come back to it afterwards. Thank you.
I did have a question, but I'm going to defer it to later about the impact of repatriation of powers under Brexit on the relationships under the devolution settlement later. Lord Beath, I think you had a question about this government engagement.
I just wanted to clear up the role of your offices, the territorial offices, which are relatively small. I presume you're not arguing for a massive boost so that they contain the policy expertise that would be necessary to cover the whole area in which there has to be interrelation between the UK and the devolved administrations. And indeed, if I were a civil servant working for a devolved administration on plant health or public health or something of that kind, I would want to talk to the people who knew about it and were there, much more likely to be located in the department which had UK responsibility or English responsibility for these matters. How do you see your offices developing? Are they, I mean, they obviously support you in your work at cabinet level. They provide some coordination and deal with the kind of thing that you just described, where there's ignorance in the civil service, and they assist you in those areas where you choose to take a major United Kingdom initiative, and one or two examples have been mentioned. But you're not arguing, are you, that your department should have the kind of expertise which is already there in other departments and is the best route for day-to-day coordination between the devolved administrations and London?
I'm not arguing that, but I know you're keen to come in, so...
I won't try and set out exact reform in full detail on these, but what I would suggest is that if at the moment an application is made for a project under Levelling Up funds, it would be assessed by officials in DLUC and go through the 5-case business model with Treasury. That latter part with Treasury could stay. I don't see why a few officials within DLUC couldn't be working temporarily in the Wales office, Scottish office in order to assess things coming in. I'm not arguing for 1 minute that the Wales office would need a huge increase in budget if it became a spending department. I would have thought that across Whitehall it could be achieved without taking on lots of extra people, simply by moving some around and changing where they work. And just to finish, within the Wales office itself, we have, I think, a really good track record of seeing people coming in, working for a while in the Wales office, and then going off and working in other civil service departments. And I encourage that, and I'm really pleased about it, because I always see those who've come through the Wales office as friends of Wales wherever they go. I'd like a few more to go into Treasury, actually, because that would be a good place to have a lot of friends. But there's no reason at all why it couldn't work in reverse, with some people in other departments coming in and temporarily working in the Wales office, all part of the same UK civil service.
Yeah, doesn't that in a way almost infantilise the UK government departments, where the expertise ought to be, and who ought to be able to handle, with some guidance from yourselves on coordination and on proper respect for the devolution procedures, that these matters could be better handled between the departments which know what they're talking about?
I don't think so. I mean, if an application comes in for a growth deal project in North Wales, I don't see why
that growth deal is a United Kingdom government initiative. I'm thinking much more of a situation where, let us say, on a policy level, the devolved government wants to go in a direction which might have complications in other parts of the Union and need to be discussed at a very technical level.
And you're absolutely right. You're right. I mean, you mentioned health. The Department for Health were discussing with the Scottish Government for some time health data being shared across the United Kingdom. And I got involved in that because the discussions, I felt, were going in the wrong direction. The discussions were going in the direction that the NHS in Scotland was getting to opt out of everything. And I felt that for improving standards of healthcare in Scotland, and also where best practice happens and being shared and improving the NHS across the United Kingdom, that there shouldn't be an opt-out. And it was done through a variety of things, but there was this sort of putting in consent clauses rather than consult clauses, and I felt it should be consult clauses because I think a consent clause salami slices. In other areas, it can salami slice the Devolution Act, which is not a good thing, the Scotland Act. But in this case, I felt it undermined the data that the NHS could harvest across the United Kingdom, collectively, the UK Health Authority I'm talking about. And it is the case that it may be in any of the devolved administrations they're doing something better than is happening in the NHS in England. And therefore, it works both ways. It's a double-edged sword. But I felt that these things are important, whereby the officials may be persuaded by the officials to sort of, as they're planning out the legislation, to let the Scottish Government not be part of it, and there are other examples. And I just feel it's very important that we're one United Kingdom, we're really one NHS, the services cross the geographical borders we have, and it's important that as best as possible we improve our standards.
Interesting response.
Lord Keane, I do want to come in for a Northern Ireland perspective in a moment, if I may, but Lord Keane.
Oh, thank you. Good morning, gentlemen. I just wanted to follow up on this question of territorial officers with Mr. Davis. We all know that there's no novelty about devolution. Northern Ireland had a devolved administration for 50 years up to 1972 and no territorial office in Westminster. But you obviously regard it as material that each of the constituent nations in the United Kingdom should have a territorial office.
And health, that you
right.
appear to be doing that.
I think each of the constituent nations of the UK should have a territorial office. I suppose you may be asking about England.
That's going to come on to Mr. Davis. It has no territorial office, and yet matters seem to proceed without any great difficulty. Is there a case for replacing the territorial officers with a Secretary of State for Constitutional Affairs of the United Kingdom and a minister for each of the constituent nations within that department, in order that we do have a coherent policy about how the United Kingdom and reserved matters are dealt with?
Well, my concern would be if that happened. I can see the consistency that you're looking for there, but the issue is perhaps that England is far more powerful and far more populous than any of the other nations of the United Kingdom. So I think the rough population of England is about 60 million, as opposed to 6 in Scotland, 3 in Wales, and 1.5 in Northern Ireland. And my concern would be that would the interests of Wales really be being heard around the cabinet table and where they should be, and would that minister have the ability, as I do, to get into any government department at any time to talk to other ministers about things, whether it's Tartar flow or whatever the issues are going to be in a few years' time? That would be my concern. But I take your point. I know my colleague wants to come in. I take your point about England, but what about the fact that we now have very powerful metro mayors in England? Is there an argument, I ask out loud, for ensuring that mayors like Sadiq Khan is included in IMGs in the same way that the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland would be? I think that might be a slightly better way to go, perhaps.
But might that not make the case for extending the idea or the concept of metropolitan mayors to Scotland and Wales, for example, so that we have devolution that goes beyond Edinburgh, that goes beyond Cardiff, which was what was intended in the first place?
I think that's an interesting suggestion, which I'm not sure I want to opine on right now, but I don't for 1 minute say that is a bad idea. I think the metro mayors in England have been a success, and I do think if I'm trying to offer some thoughts as to how the constitution might be improved, I really do think we now need to start thinking about how we include metro mayors in the sorts of discussions that we currently have with first ministers.
I think.
Well, so yes, on that last point, I agree. I think devolution has been undermined by the SNP, Scottish Government. They've sucked powers to the centre, got rid of the local tourist boards, got rid of the local enterprise boards, got rid of all the chief constables and from the counties, and created one constabulary across the whole country with one chief constable. And I could go on. The fire service has been centralised, and on it goes. And I think devolution, the spirit of devolution, should have been to keep devolving the powers and to strengthen local authorities. I think that would have been terribly important. On your Secretaries of State for the territorial offices point, for me, it's about. I think doing what you're proposing would weaken the Union, weaken the United Kingdom. I think it's very good that there is a Secretary of State for Wales, for Northern Ireland, for Scotland, and I think it's also. And as the Secretary of State for Wales has said, they're arguing for their own area of office in Cabinet, and that's very important, and across Whitehall. And it's also having someone who's passionate about the country they represent. That's terribly important, I think, in government, because there are a lot of voices around the Cabinet table. More and more, every time I go back to a new Cabinet, it seems to have got bigger and bigger. And you need someone shouting loudly for your if you like, for your policy or your chosen area or what you believe in. And it's important, it's very important, I think, that Scotland is strongly represented in that Cabinet room.
I think Lord Kane was going to...
Well, very quickly, you mentioned devolution in Northern Ireland from 1921 to 72. There might be some who would argue that the experience of that period is an unanswerable case for having a territorial department, and that actually some of the issues which occurred during that period might have been prevented had there been more involvement from this place. So I think it's actually a strong argument for having having the.
You have to rush, because I want to give you the floor.
One very important point, just to add.
We can stay till lunchtime.
Feel free to.
On the rolling them into three. I just remind the Committee that the Northern Ireland Secretary does have responsibilities which are unique, not least in respect of national security, as Lord Anderson of Ipswich knows all too well from one of his previous roles. That makes his position or her position very different from the other two territorial ministers. I remember with Peter Hain and also final Peter Hain and Paul Murphy combined being Wales Secretary and Northern Ireland Secretary. I always used to wonder what would happen when Northern Ireland and Wales were going after the same, US company to locate in a particular jurisdiction. Who would they back?
Would you like to elaborate on, in terms of engagement with the government, is in your view their scope, or is there an area where you would strengthen the role of the Northern Ireland office in facilitating that engagement?
I mean, I generally think it works. I think it works quite well. I go back to an earlier answer, which is, after 2010, there was an attempt to put in place a more structured relationship with the Northern Ireland Executive. And to work collaboratively with it. That kind of broke down when we got into all sorts of political crises in 2014, 2015. And then, of course, we had long periods from 2017, 5 of the 7 years from after 2017 when there was no devolved administration whatsoever. So I just think we now need to look forward and put in place a much more structured relationship. We're trying to do that.
And the supplementary point which Keane was developing, do you think, given the particular situation in Northern Ireland, that government departments need to have someone who has almost a responsibility for being alert to any Northern Ireland dimension that might come up, or do you feel that's catered for, that there's an alarm bell goes off somewhere, or do you think they need to do more to...
I mean, it goes to some extent back to Lord Beast's question about, the expertise in particular departments. The Northern Ireland Office doesn't have, great expertise in the area of agriculture and rural affairs, or indeed, on the health service specifically. But then, DEFRA doesn't have great expertise in the politics of Northern Ireland. So we work collaboratively on matters. So yes, they can deal with the technical side of things, but they need to. And so we generally act as a department which will alert other parts of Whitehall as to particular issues, particular nuances.
I completely accept your point. I think what I was saying is, like, accepting your point, are you confident that DEFRA or any other relevant department would be alert enough, quickly enough, for Northern Ireland dimension?
Yes, and they consult us regularly.
Fine. Baroness Cordy, did you have a quick point on this, or no? I think you've kind of... No,
I may have missed something. There was a very simple premise put forward, which is, are you satisfied with the existing arrangements for the territorial offices in working with the DAs, or did you want something else whereby all the DAs in relation to reserved issues would funnel things through the territorial offices?
Yes, I think that point wasn't brought up, so I think that is a fresh point. We think it works better when the officials in the Scottish Government deal with the officials in the Scotland office first. But what tends to happen, so if they went to the Health Department first, what would happen is the Health Department would get in touch with us or whichever, and then we would advise them on where there may be pitfalls or issues and give them that expertise, and that would solve the problem, hopefully. I mean, 90% of the time that works. I mean, there has been a thing, I mean, being political about this, for quite a while the Scottish Government have decided to go round the Scotland office. I mean, that points back to problems that we may, it's this thing about, do we tell them enough about the legislation we're bringing forward? Yes, I think we do. We engage with them very early on, particularly at official level. They don't engage with us, with their legislation very early on, far from it. I mean, it was no different, I think I said at the COVID inquiry, Michael Gove and I and the other Secretaries of State would have weekly meetings with the First Ministers and the Deputy First Ministers, weekly meetings during COVID, and we told them everything that the UK, remember we'd given them huge powers in the COVID Act, and we told them everything the UK government was doing, timings, changing rules and regulations, doing this, doing that. They never told us anything. It was one-way traffic. And that's the problem. Now, that's for them to answer to, but it is a fact that the information flow tends to be all one way.
But you seem to be suggesting, Secretary of State, that there's a kind of workable modus operandi.
Yeah, no. I mean, when devolution works, because despite the fact we have a government in Scotland that wants to destroy the United Kingdom and wants to destroy devolution, doesn't believe in devolution, we have officials with a GB-wide civil service that are able to transact, and then as ministers we go in and try and cut deals and get things done, and that's what we always want to do. I want to defend the devolution settlement. I want to get business done, but not at any cost, not throwing away the powers this Parliament has. That's critically important, because if we start setting those precedents, we'll come back to regret it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lord Thomas, you had a question on goodwill, the dependency on goodwill.
And the last point made by Mr. Jack is very pertinent, saying there's no communication over the COVID issue properly with the Scottish Government. Now, to what extent does the successful operation of the intergovernmental relationship depend on goodwill from all four governments? And in particular, how do you avoid the relationship between the territorial departments and the relevant devolved governments becoming politicised? And can I refer to Secretary of State for Wales? Secretary of State, you have recently very publicly attacked the proposal to extend the number of Assembly members to 96. I can understand you doing that as a Member of Parliament for Monmouth, but is it appropriate for the Secretary of State to take on something like that?
Well, so, I mean, we are all politicians, and at the end of the day, I don't agree that spending £120 million on creating extra Senate members is a good use of public funds, and I feel that I've got a duty to say that.
As Secretary of State?
Well, I could say it in any capacity that I want. I mean, people can attach whatever label they want to it, but I disagree profoundly with that, and I think it's right that it be called out. But I'm surprised that the Labour Party in Parliament are so keen to publicise this, because as far as I can tell, it's not a measure that's gone down particularly well in Wales, any more than the 20-mile-an-hour speed limits have.
And you've spoken out about that?
Yes, indeed, yes. And the failure to deliver healthcare to the standards that are expected now rightly in England, and the fact that we have the lowest educational standards in the whole of the United Kingdom according to PISA, and the decision to tell farmers that 10% of their land would have to be handed over to have trees planted and another 10% for other wildlife schemes. These are all policies that have been brought forward by the Welsh Labour government, and about which I feel I have the right to speak out about.
The tone of your attack is such as not to have goodwill between you and the Welsh government at all, is it?
Well, I disagree because...
Put you at odds.
I disagree because I've never made any personal attacks on people, but I've expressed my view as to what the policy should be, and I have a duty and a right to do that. And I'm slightly concerned, to be honest, by the way in which, if you forgive me for saying this, the Labour Party sometimes seem to want to shut down legitimate debate about their policies rather than go out and argue them. If Labour politicians think that spending £120 million on extra Senate members is a good idea, well, let them go out and say so, rather than attacking me for criticising the policy.
Lord Kane, in Northern Ireland there's been conflict between the Secretary of State and all the political parties over the legacy issues, and the bill that was passed that you conducted through the House of Lords. That really has not caused goodwill between the Northern Irish and the Assembly.
Well, forgive me, I could probably speak for the rest of the session on this particular piece of legislation and its history, but I'll try and avoid that. Suffice to say that every previous attempt to deal with that subject had founded on lack of consensus. And eventually the government just had to make an assessment of what was deliverable in current circumstances. To go back to the premise, though, I mean, I can only speak in a Northern Ireland context, and we are slightly different from Scotland and Wales in that, quite a key point, while my party has a small presence in Northern Ireland, we're not in direct political competition with the two largest parties or the main political parties in Northern Ireland. As you know, it's mainly a separate party system there. We are all committed to upholding and implementing the Belfast Agreement, or as the DUP would say, the Belfast Agreement as amended by St Andrews. And ultimately, if this is going to work, we do have to find a way of working together, even though many of us share very different ultimate political aspirations. So over a number of years, I found a way of working with Martin McGuinness. Even though we wouldn't agree on a great deal, frankly, but if we're going to uphold stability in Northern Ireland, support the institutions and see the institutions work, then of course there has to be a degree of goodwill. But it is a slightly different context, I think, to the context that David's speaking about and Alister would speak about.
If I could move us on a little on this, because I'm conscious I want to get to a couple of key constitutional issues we haven't got to yet. Did you want to come on the politicised point or no?
I think we've pretty much covered it. The cooperation and collaboration and politicisation, and particularly if it's got worse in the last few years. And I was struck by what Lord Thomas said, because there was gradually the impression that it was okay for the devolved administrations to criticise central government, but not for central government to criticise the devolved assemblies. Do you think that's a fair view?
Well, I was getting that feeling as well, to be honest. I mean, all I'd say to Lord Thomas is that politics is a reality. There are strains. Of course, there are going to be strains when you have governments of different backgrounds. Was it a different story when there was, and Baroness Goldie will know this better than me because she was there at the time, but was it a different story when there was a Labour-led administration in Scotland up until 2007, with a Labour government in Westminster? Yes. I mean, a lot of what's in the Scotland Act was probably written on the premise that there would always be, and actually a number of Labour MPs of the time have said this to me, it was written on the basis that they thought that Labour would. Yes. They gave themselves a soft pass when they wrote the Scotland Act. Let me put it that way, because they thought Labour would be in power in Scotland, and they'd be dealing with a unionist government in Westminster. So politics is a reality. Strains are enormous between us and the Scottish government, being SNP-led and wanting to break up the United Kingdom. I don't pretend otherwise. But what is important is that when we disagree respectfully, and that's the best we can hope for. Okay, let's, if I could move on now to the issue of delegated powers, Henry VIII powers, this whole issue of preparation of legislation, which I think, Mr. Jack, you in part touched on in your opening statement. I think, Lord Anderson, you're going to take us through this.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Bills placed before this Parliament often delegate powers to ministers of the United Kingdom government to make regulations in areas of devolved competence. Sometimes they even give ministers of the United Kingdom government the power to alter acts of devolved legislatures, so-called Henry VIII clauses, but particularly controversial perhaps in this context. Now, the Sewell Convention, of course, does not apply to secondary legislation, but this committee has often expressed the view in the past that these powers should only be exercised after consultation with the devolved administrations, and normally only with their consent. Indeed, we've sometimes recommended that an obligation to consult be placed on the face of the bill. So my question is, what are your views on that? And can you tell us anything about the mechanisms that I assume already exist to ensure that devolved administrations are consulted prior to the introduction of delegated powers in areas of devolved competence, particularly when those powers extend to altering the acts of devolved legislatures?
So the first thing is that the Parliamentary Business Legislation Committee, which the Leader of the House of Lords sits on, the Chief Whip in the Lords, the three territorial offices, I attend those meetings, and that is when bills are brought forward, and that is when the Office for Parliamentary Counsel will point out areas that would be those concerns. And that is when we stress that communication has to take place with the devolved administrations about those. I mean, as to the delegated powers, as you know, cuts both ways. If you take Brexit, we had to do it because we had to get the legislation through to avoid a no-deal Brexit. If you take COVID, we were putting in delegated powers to delegate the powers to the devolved administrations. It wasn't delegating the powers to Westminster. It was delegating the powers so that the devolved administrations could get on and do what they had to do with the emergency legislation they needed during COVID. So it cuts both ways. But the mechanism for highlighting it is the PBL committee, which I've just outlined. And I think it's very important that we do discuss with the devolved administrations what we're going to do. But it is the reality that it happens, that delegated powers have to be taken from time to time, and it has always happened. It's not something new, and it's not always a bad thing. I mean, the one going through at the moment is the Victims and Prisoners Bill, currently going through, and there's delegated powers being taken in a devolved area to establish a compensation scheme for those affected by the infected blood scandal, those who need compensation for that. So now, we've given, you raised a consent mechanism in there. I'm not a fan of consent mechanisms. I prefer consult, because I think consent mechanisms allow us to have our feet held to the fire later on other things in the future. But we should always have a responsibility on us to consult, and that way you're highlighting issues in future that are coming up because you are consulting, or as is the case of the infected blood, you're keeping the devolved administration informed of how that is proceeding and how the compensation is being played out.
Would either of the others like to make any comment?
Well, simply add so that The figures will show that I think there have only been eight occasions when the Senator denied an LCM, and these have been in areas, as we've discussed before, around the EU and UKIM. So on the vast majority of occasions, we've actually managed to secure LCMs, and we've done that through, as my colleague has said, through making sure that there is a great deal of discussion at an official level as legislation is passed, and as soon as it gets to PBL, then we are both usually very keen to remind everyone present of the need to consult with, well, in my case, with the Senate. So I think the figures that we have would suggest that on the vast majority of occasions the system works well, and on the rare occasions when it doesn't, there's usually some strong political motive on both sides.
Concur with my colleagues. Just occasionally it is unavoidable. I'll give you one very quick example. The Northern Ireland Identity and Language Act that I took to the House of Lords contains step-in powers for the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland to appoint 3 commissioners who should in normal circumstances be appointed by the First and Deputy First Ministers. But of course, in circumstances where they can't agree, the Secretary of State has that power because the commitments were contained in the New Decade, New Approach agreement from 2020. So, and I remember discussing with the opposition, whose view at the time was regrettable but understandable.
I understand what I think you're all saying, which is that you cannot always require consent. But what I don't think I'm hearing from you is any situation in which you shouldn't have to consult when a minister proposes to, or is given the power to act in an area of devolved responsibility.
We do usually put consult clauses in. I mean, I've pressed for consult clauses over consent clauses on many occasions. Pretty much in every PBL that's come along, I've pressed for consult clauses. At that point about we've only legislated, and the Scottish Government have withheld consent. It's only 10 times out of literally hundreds of bills. So, and they, as you know, most of them are either trade deals linked to Brexit or Brexit legislation. So it's not. The norm is that we legislate with consent. That is the norm. Lord Faulkner, I think.
It's just to press this a little. I completely understand what you're all saying about the fact there will be occasions when you need to have the ability to override what the devolved Parliamentary Assembly is saying. But I'm not hearing what your answer is to the question, why is there a distinction in process between a primary piece of UK legislation that changes devolved legislation as opposed to a delegated piece of legislation? So we've got, from time to time, the UK government takes power in a piece of primary legislation to say the minister can change devolved acts of the devolved parliament. Then the minister produces a statutory instrument which then changes the powers of the devolved parliament, for example. Now, we all agree that the UK government has to consult and get the consent of the devolved parliamentary assemblies in relation to a thing that affects a devolved area. I understand your point about you've got to keep the power to do it even if they don't consent, but I'm not following why the same process should not be used before a minister overrides legislation in a devolved area. If Parliament's got to at least try to get consent, why shouldn't a minister?
Well, sorry.
Go on.
Well, actually, I was going to say, Lord Faulkner, obviously I'm aware of the major rows, or shall we say discussions over UKIM and Brexit and the rest of it. I'm sure, obviously, what you say, sir, is absolutely correct.
My lord.
My lord. Okay, I'm going to be honest with you. I think, can you give me an example of where that's happened in Wales? Because I'm not aware of one off the top of my head. The examples that I'm aware of are the very big ones that have been all over the press. I'm not aware that we've literally taken powers away. We may have given a minister in the UK government theoretically the power to change something in Wales that's devolved, but I'm not aware of any minister absolutely exercising.
Do I take it from that, Secretary of State, that you're saying if that was to happen, you would, in effect, go through the same procedure as you would if it was a piece of primary legislation?
My lord, I would say that
I'm not a legal expert, but unless I were aware of an actual situation rather than the hypothetical one, then
Nationality and Borders Bill and an assurance we got from the government under the Trade Australia and New Zealand Bill are two that come to mind straight away, but there are others.
Baroness Drake, the trade bill was one that I referenced. Absolutely. That is one where there's been a fundamental difference of opinion between the UK government and the Wales government. And I think it would be wrong to give the Wales government the power effectively to block any trade deal. So that is the trade deals, the Brexit stuff, the UK, those I all acknowledge. We have legislated across the UK. I've got the list of 8 occasions in front of me. But I'm not aware of any... and I'm sure there have been, but I'm not aware of any occasions where UK government ministers have been given a power to amend or override Senate legislation in devolved areas where they've actually used that right and taken powers away. I'm not aware of an instance where that's happened, although I'm perfectly happy to accept it may have done, but I'd ask your noble lord to give me an example.
Well, the example we've got is Section 80 of the Nationality and Borders Act 2022, which gives the secretaries gives the power to change Scottish and Welsh legislation. It doesn't. The Sulh Convention doesn't apply. If what you're saying, Secretary of State, is if we were able to use those powers, we would do the same as what we would do in relation to a piece of prime legislation, then that means that the committee and the Secretaries of State would be on the same page in relation to it. We need to think about what the right structure was, but what we're struggling with in this committee is why should there be a difference? You've got to go through the process for prime legislation. It must be a sort of stronger case if it's a minister doing it using delegated powers.
My lord, that would obviously be a reserved matter, nationalities and borders.
Not completely.
Let me give another example. When the retained EU law bill was going through, it contained provision for United Kingdom ministers to make regulations in areas of devolved competence. This committee recommended that the bill be amended to require UK ministers to consult the relevant devolved administrations. And from memory, that didn't happen. I'll be corrected if I was wrong about that. If there was reticence on that score, I'm just interested to understand why. We weren't requiring consent. We were only suggesting a requirement of consultation.
I have to delve back a little bit into the recess of my memory because I haven't got this here, and I wasn't the Secretary of State at the time that went through. But my recollection is that this was in an area in which the power to make that legislation had previously resided with the European Union. And so this was a power that was being taken away from Brussels and given to London, but hadn't really been exercised within the devolved administrations previously. Is that a fair response to that point?
Well,
I would be keen if you could just address the...
I wouldn't mind, no, genuinely. I mean, I know the noble lords here know what they're talking about. I'm happy to look at specific examples. I absolutely acknowledge that in theory this is what a power that a United Kingdom government minister may get, but I'm not aware of any occasion where it has in practice been used other than the ones which I've outlined. We've discussed UKIM, Brexit and trade.
Well, if in practice there isn't a problem, then it may be we're on the same page, because there would seem to be no reason why a requirement to consult shouldn't be written into legislation.
Whatever some noble lords might think, it's not our wish to deliberately sort of wind up the Senate government by legislating in areas that are devolved. But may I throw something back, which is that I sometimes feel that the Welsh government do want to push their luck as far as reserve matters are concerned, and the elections bill is a case in point where they are, particularly around the gender aspects of that, acting in a way that the Speaker of the Senate has said is clearly trying to legislate in a reserved field. So notwithstanding the implied criticism of what you're suggesting, it is certainly a criticism that could be levelled back at the
Really, no criticism is being implied.
Okay.
We're simply exploring the limits of the Sewell Convention. It doesn't apply to secondary legislation. Effectively, why not? And would you object to there being an understanding that devolved administrations would at least always be consulted, even if their consent couldn't always be obtained? That's
in the spirit of the way that you're asking the question, I'd be happy to look at specific examples of where you think this has been misused and right to the noble lords.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Just on that point.
Just to be clear on the government's view on that, and we've done the debate now, but the government's position is that the Sewell Convention should not apply to secondary legislation. Consult clauses, I've always said I prefer over consent clauses. I've made that my position very clear on that. But the government's position is that the Sewell Convention should not apply to secondary legislation.
Which is a little odd, really, isn't it?
I'm just telling you what the position is. I'm not.
Yes, I understand. I understand that.
You know, I'm just saying. I just want to be
you might think it was
clear
worse,
for the record. That's all.
You might think it was worse for a minister to alter an act of.
I suspect the view is that it's gone through. It's gone through primary legislation with the Sewell Convention, and therefore, it having gone through primary legislation, it shouldn't go through secondary legislation. That is the sort of standing position. But you know,
I assume you are continuing the practice of successive governments, since Sewell Conventions were originally created. Which did not apply to secondary legislation.
We're totally respectful. Exactly. No, this has always been the case, and we're very respectful of the Sewell Convention, as I say, and we don't think it needs altering, as I've said already. We don't believe that at all. There have been recently, the Scottish Government have obviously made great play of us legislating without consent, but as I've made very clear, either trade deals, and let's be clear, the SNP never backed a trade deal in the European Parliament, and they weren't backing any trade deals in this Parliament, you know. So we knew where we stood on that, but we had to get our trade deals done, and we had to get the Brexit legislation done to have a softer landing, and that was why we proceeded as we did.
Well, what's your objection in principle to a minister not normally legislating in devolved matters through secondary legislation without consent of the devolved administration?
Well, as I say, this is not something I've given a terrible amount of thought to, but the position as things stand is, I'll just reiterate what I said. The government's position is that the Sewell Convention does not apply to secondary legislation. Yeah, that's the position. And
but what's the objection? We don't understand it.
Well, we will write. If you want, we can look further into that and write to you in some detail on what our position is. But that is the government's position, and I haven't come along today to change it.
It's not a veto.
Can I just a moment? We are coming on to the issue of the Sewell Convention in a moment, and Lord Keith's got a question on that. The issue of the government using delegated powers. Delegated legislation is a wider problem for the House of Lords. You're probably aware of the Delegated Powers Committee report to the House, which was received and accepted, that actually there's a growing trend to use delegated legislation rather than primary legislation. That general problem also manifests itself when it comes to the areas of devolved competence. And we did get a commitment from the government where they reiterated the importance of making every effort to achieve consent in the exercise of delegated powers in devolved areas. How do you operationalise that commitment from government?
Can I clarify just on this last point, because I got slightly cut off there. If we are amending the legislation in the devolved administration, then we always consent. Consult. Sorry, we always consult. Okay, we always consult. So that's why we don't believe there's a need for a formal mechanism, because if what we're doing is amending devolved administration legislation, then consultation takes place. Even with the secondary powers, it takes place. So I think. That's why I'm not sure we're that far apart, to be honest.
But what we don't have is the evidence of what you've just said, that if devolved legislation is impacting on areas of devolved legislation. How are you operating? How are you doing?
Well, and we can write you on that. I'm not sure there are many examples, as the Secretary of State for Wales said, where it's actually happened. There are a few, but there aren't many, and we'd be very happy to write to you on what consultation took place.
For my part, that would be very useful, and I was reassured by what you just said, Secretary of State. But I should say we did have written evidence from DLUC indicating that the UK government seeks the agreement of devolved administrations for statutory instruments in devolved areas where there is a statutory requirement or an existing political commitment to do so. And that sounded to me a little less full-hearted than the reassurance that you just offered.
DLUC often are less full-hearted than me.
So, anything you could do to clarify that, certainly I would
Maybe we can exchange correspondence to clarify that, because that is something we want to
indeed
report on. But whether or not the Soil Convention should be extended is another question we want to come on to. But you had a specific question, Lord Strathclyde.
Yes, it's a detailed point, but you talked earlier on about the legislative committees that you all sit on. So to what extent are specific instructions given to Parliamentary Council about the use of secondary legislation, and are they in a position, or do you ask them to be in a position, to tell you what their view is of the requirement to consult? We've seen a huge increase in the amount of use of secondary legislation, and it's good to know just what the relationship is between the Legislative Committee and Parliamentary Council.
Well, we're always directed by Parliamentary Council on these matters. I mean, the PBL that I mentioned, where you have the Leader of the Lords and both Chief Whips and the Treasury and the territorial offices are present. We tend, I mean, the Bill Minister is important for the bill. Any other legislation coming forward, the department's responsible for it, and they work with Parliamentary Council to get something that is fit for presentation. And it never ceases to surprise me how many times Parliamentary Council send things back and say we're not ready to go. We can't bring this bill forward, and we listen to that. We take a decision. The chair, who's the leader of the House of Commons, the Lord President, will conclude, following discussion on many occasions, that legislation is not fit as OPC would like it to be, and so a lot of work goes into that.
So, from that, I sense that Parliamentary Council don't specifically advise about the role of secondary legislation on the powers of devolved administrations. But
that is for, as I said, that's for the Bill Minister and for the advisors. And on my left we have the former Advocate General for Scotland, who would also have been a member of the PBL committee, and he would have been advising. Is that a fair point, Lord Keane?
That is correct.
Yeah.
Had you finished?
Yes.
Lord Ford.
Just to pursue that a little bit, I would be interested in the question, do you have special procedures where if you are giving a minister power by being able to promote secondary legislation, he or she can amend devolved legislation? Is there some procedure whereby before that happens, you've got to be consulted?
Yeah, and
because there'll be lots of bills going through which you are not primarily involved in. Yes. Is that a red light for you? What's the instructions given within government about that situation?
We have to be consulted, and they have to have, as I said, if they're amending devolved administration legislation, they have to have consulted the devolved administrations, and we need to see the outcome of those discussions.
But I'm talking about where the bill itself does not amend the devolved legislation, but a minister is given power, should he or she wish in the future, to do so. And I'm interested to know what's the instruction within government in relation to that. And do you have an attitude?
It's on a case-by-case basis, and we debate it in PBL.
Okay. Would you expect to consult your relevant devolved administration or parliament if you were giving a UK minister power to change devolved legislation in a devolved area?
Yes, our officials would, and our legal department would be discussing it with theirs.
Can you recall an occasion, or has it ever happened, where that consultation has taken place and the drafting of the bill has been changed as a result of the fact that you've taken cognizance of what the devolved Parliamentary Assembly have said?
There will be examples, and in the interests of time, I will write to you, but there will be examples.
I could give an example on the Northern Ireland Legacy Bill, which Lord Thomas referred to. There was a part of it that did touch on the Scottish courts, and I consulted with the Solicitor General for Scotland and changed the legislation.
Okay. We would be interested to hear detail of that. That's very
I'll provide
Thank you.
detail.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, and I do want to get on to the Sewell Convention. I'll just take this one, but I think what we're, it's a sort of subset of a debate that we've already had, is in the actual issue of consulting to seek legislative consent, is giving us a sense of the experience you're having on that particular issue, both in Scottish Parliament, the Senate, and the Northern Ireland Assembly. Mr. Jack, do you want to open?
Sorry, this is the experience of consulting. You went a bit quiet. My tinnitus got the better of me there.
The purposes of securing or seeking legislative consent on that particular issue, sharing with us some general observations you would make as a result of experiencing the process of seeking legislative consent?
I think, I mean, again, in the interest, I think we've covered this, to be honest. I mean, we engage with the Scottish Government through officials, through the legal departments, and then through ministers if there's a problem. But if there isn't a problem, everything proceeds quietly, and as many bills do, it proceeds quietly in the right direction. And where there are issues, we try and seek alternative solutions. As I've said, my preference is for consult clauses to be put in. We have, at the moment, we've got the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. There's been some disagreement with the Scottish Government on parts of that, but solutions have been found. Powers, I've actually made a note of them here, powers that were held by Scottish ministers in the Electricity Act they were lost due to the repeal of the European Communities Act 1972. Those powers to let the Regeneration Act go ahead with an LCM, there was a mechanism put in there, and the Secretary of State at the dispatch box said, look, we will address this issue, we will transfer the functions to you, and that's going through now, and the Scotland office are working to deliver this. That's something that's on us to get over the finishing line. So we do and are always trying to get legislation through where we are seeking a legislative consent motion, and we are consulting in a respectful manner.
Lord Davis, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, there's one thing I want to add, and I don't know if it'd be helpful or not, but I've been thinking about the way in which these questions are being asked, and clearly there is a concern on this committee which I hadn't previously been aware of elsewhere, that UK government ministers, through secondary legislation, have been given powers to, if you like, you haven't put it this way, but to ride roughshod over the devolved settlement. And funnily enough, although I've dealt with many criticisms from Welsh Government and beyond about relationships and the way we approach devolution, I haven't really heard that. I've heard, obviously, on the 8 or so pieces of legislation where we have legislated without an LCM, which is UKIP, Brexit, trade deals, then obviously there's been a great big political row. But I've not really heard the criticism that we're constantly giving secondary powers to UK government ministers to legislate in devolved areas. It's not really a criticism I've had to deal with before. So I'm taking seriously what the committee is saying. And I think the Secretary of State for Scotland had a point, and maybe it was Lord Strathclyde, in pointing out that when we pass a piece of legislation that is going to have an impact in a devolved area, there is a lot of consultation beforehand, many members of this committee have been in PBL, as I have over the years. We discuss very much what is the impact on devolved bodies going to be, devolved administrations. What sort of consultation has gone on? I don't want to give actual examples, but I know in some instances we've gone back to ministers and said, you need to go consult a lot more. We want things to go through smoothly. We want to get LCMs wherever we can. But if we took something like, for example, the smoking ban, the smoking legislation, there is a big debate going on here, and we have the support of the Welsh Government in passing this bit of legislation. I'm absolutely certain, though I can't give you examples, but I'm absolutely certain that within that there will probably be secondary legislation and there'll be powers probably given to UK ministers to legislate in what will effectively be in health areas. But the fact that we've already discussed the main legislation with the Senedd and got their agreement to it means that I think it's reasonable to assume that they will be happy with a UK government minister having the power to pass secondary legislation over a period of time into the future. So I wonder if that answers the main question here. In part, but the
fact that you've said you're not aware of it rings a slight alarm bell, because in a sense, and we're just trying to get from you what you do and you know, what you say you do in relation to seeking consent. But we have various sources of evidence that indicate that there is a perception or a belief, or whoever is giving the evidence will have varying views, that the government is increasingly using secondary legislation or Henry VIII powers, either in the moment or for future opportunity, to circumvent the consent process. And we are trying to identify exactly the extent of that problem and what you say you do.
I just say, in the interest of brevity, it really, I mean, in some ways I would ask you, if you, I mean, slightly cheeky this, Chair, but if you know, if you wrote to us about the amount of times this has happened, it's very, very small. And Henry VIII powers, if you have concerns, I'd be very interested to know when we've used them, because it is absolutely not our modus operandi. And I just believe it's vanishingly small, the amount of times it has happened. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, and there may be very good reasons why it did happen, but let's explore those. You know, when you know we can write to you, and if you feel there are many more cases that we've missed, then by all means, please come back to us.
I've taken that point, and we'll do that. And it's not only the exercising the Henry VIII power, it's actually banking that power in order to potentially use it at some future point.
Which I think we've agreed would be consulted upon if it was a changing devolved administration legislation. That's the government's policy.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it would be useful to have that.
Madam Chair, may I just say on that point, though, the UK government is still sovereign and therefore has the power to legislate in any area, as I understand it, in the future.
Challenging the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. We're looking at the governance and integrity and confidence in how the devolution settlement works. We're not seeking to rewrite the Constitution on parliamentary sovereignty. Right. I think we had another... Lord Burnett, do you want to develop your point to Lord Kane on this?
Yes, this is really a question for Lord Kane, which I suspect can be dealt with very quickly, given the time pressures we have.
I'll try.
In your opening remarks, you identified the differences between the Northern Ireland settlement and those in Scotland and Wales, and in particular the fact that the devolved institutions can be suspended, and we know that they were for a long time recently. We're interested just to have a general sense from you of what the impact of having no assembly and no administration in Northern Ireland had on seeking devolved consent, because obviously the ordinary ways of dealing with things couldn't operate, and also how it's going now.
Just we'll try and be very brief. Just on a technical point, the most recently the institutions were not suspended.
Give me
the power to suspend was actually repealed in the St Andrews Agreement Act 2007. They simply didn't function.
give that solecism.
Okay, they didn't function. And to suspend would have required fresh primary legislation. Anyway, in short, how did the absence of the Assembly and the Executive affect the process? Well, I've lost count of the number of times when I turned up at the PBL committee and said, in normal circumstances, this would require an LCM process, but as there is no Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly, we can't engage that process. But what we did during that period was consult very, very closely with the Northern Ireland Civil Service, with the permanent secretaries, with the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service, quite often at those PBL meetings, I would say, make it very clear that our departmental view was that the sponsoring department needed to continue those conversations during the development and the passage of the legislation, and that was made very clear. And I think, though, I asked my officials, I think there were about probably 20, around 20, can't be precise, but around 20 bills which would have normally engaged the LCM process in Northern Ireland, which during the most recent period of non-functioning between 22 and 24 just didn't take place. Now that the Executive and Assembly are back up and running, functioning, the LCM process is similarly functioning. There are currently 3 LCM memorandums being considered by the Assembly in relation to pet, abduction, tobacco and vapes, and of course the Post Office Horizons offences bills. And one LCM has already been secured for the Pensions Special Rules for End-of-Life Bill. Thank you. And long may it continue.
Thank you. Lord Keane, duty to engage.
Gentlemen, I wonder if I could return momentarily to the Sewell Convention. Of course, we understand that it is just that, a political convention, not a legal obligation. And it's often approached on the basis that this political convention applies to the Westminster government and that it's for that government to exercise its obligations under the Sewell Convention. But can I suggest that actually what underlies the Sewell Convention is a bilateral obligation. The LCM process can't work unless there is engagement not only by the Westminster government but by the devolved administrations with regard to this matter. And I just want to raise the question of whether the operation of the Sewell Convention might be improved, the requirement for engagement underlined, if there was an express obligation of a duty to engage in good faith, not only on Westminster, but on each of the devolved administrations when it comes to trying to resolve the issue of operating within devolved competence. And
I don't think, I hear all you say, and I think there should be an obligation on both. I think there is an obligation on both under the Convention, but I think a duty takes it to a higher place than I would be comfortable with. I think, is it going to improve things? I don't think so. I think the Convention works very well, and we always engage. By nature of that, certainly my experience with the Scottish Government is they have to engage, and they make it very clear to us very early on, if it's linked to Brexit, that they're not engaging. At least we know where we stand on that. On other matters, the engagement, I think, works very well. And I would stress that we have legislated without consent 10 times. We have legislated with consent, I think it's over 200 times. So it really, and it was something that wasn't expected. And it's really important to remember this. When this Scotland Act happened in 1990, it was put together in 1998. When devolution then happened in 1999 and the Scottish Parliament was set up, no one envisaged when they wrote that act that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union. Mm-hmm. That was not, in the same way I think Labour wrote themselves a soft ticket, as I've said before, because they thought that they were shooting the nationalist fox. I think also, in a similar vein, they didn't write it thinking that we'd leave. So there was bound to be a bump in the road when we left the European Union. And I think we've got over that now. We've moved forward. The trade deals, there may still be some obstruction to trade deals, but there's enormous consultation goes on during the trade deals, a huge amount of stakeholder engagement with, for instance, around farming with the NFU Scotland and other bodies. We really do put a lot of effort into getting these trade deals right. I think broadly, just to go back to the thing, I don't think there should be a duty to engage. I think that the Sewell Convention is, in the main, bar bumps in the road, as we saw with Brexit, is working.
I just wonder whether it might assist senior officials if they were able to go back to a devolved government and say, you can't simply ignore this. You have an obligation, a duty, to engage in the consent mechanism, even if you anticipate not consenting.
I think they do anyway. I mean, other than, as I say, when there was we're not discussing Brexit with you. I mean, in all other, I do think they engage. I think the level of engagement is good. Thank you.
Lord Anderson, do you have any?
I don't think there's anything I want to add.
No. I just come in on that. I mean, you have described, and correct me if I'm wrong, Secretary of State for Scotland, a sort of slight tinge of exasperation about the way that the Scottish Government behaved during the conduct of COVID. You said you gave them great powers. Yeah. When you said you gave them great powers, what were you referring to?
So we delegated the powers for the emergency powers to the Scottish Government to then get on and do everything they wanted to do. I suppose I was going back to my points that I made in the COVID committee that whilst we shared information, the information flow was not coming the other way as to what they were going to do, and they tended to follow look at our decisions, then do slightly something different a couple of days later. It was very frustrating, and I feel the First Minister was very political in the way she conducted herself, and I've said that on the record already. That's what I was referring to.
Good governance,
yeah,
one would have thought, would have involved people cooperating,
Agreed.
Even though, for example, the SNP or Plaid want to get rid of the union altogether. Nevertheless, in the current arrangement, they want to cooperate. Yeah. You're never going to get people to cooperate, always, in politics. But what is wrong with there being a quite light touch obligation to engage? So, for example, in relation to the depositors' return scheme, even though they may be playing politics, they may be trying to make the British government look bad, nevertheless, there's got to be formal discussions about it, they've got to be minuted, you've got to be able to put your point of view. Gender recognition was another area where you were bold in relation to that. Had there been a clearer duty to engage, you wouldn't have ended up, as one did on gender recognition, where there was a he said, she said, as to whose fault it was there hadn't been proper engagement. And the courts would be very reluctant to intervene, but as the former Advocate General says, ministers and officials would be operating in an atmosphere where their duty, and maybe some people would say this is what the public would expect, their duty is to do their best to get the best for the people of Scotland.
So I think that the officials are engaging at an early stage, but I think that this will change if there's a unionist administration, whatever coalition that may take in Holyrood. You'll see this problem go away, and I don't think the Scottish Government would pay any attention to any duty to engage or change their approach towards us. They want to destroy devolution. They want to break up the United Kingdom. It's not in their interest to make it work. And I think it would be naive of us to think that anything is going to change that. You mentioned the gender recognition. They decided they were going to challenge us on that, whether it come what may. I wrote to them on UNCRC, the rights of the child. They decided to ignore my letter and challenge us come what may. They challenged even though Lord Hope of Craighead said that their case was devastating, our case was devastating for them, they still challenged me or the UK government in court and lost convincingly, and then have now accepted they'll pay our costs. And I think that's this is the way. Creating a grievance and a fight is part of what they do. It's part of their playbook, and we must recognise that. And I actually think the Sewell Convention, in the main, works very well. And it wasn't going to change anything. Coming the other way regarding their legislation, because we did tell them that there were issues around the Equality Act regarding the gender recognition, adverse effects. We did, and the deposit return scheme, explain what the problems were. But it doesn't stop them ploughing on, I'm afraid, Because they either get their legislation over the finishing line or they have a fight. They don't mind which, because they're not of the United Kingdom.
Let me just take another example.
Yeah.
Looking forward, there is every possibility, and this is, you tell me just you can't deal with this if you don't want to deal with it. Yeah. There's every possibility that Scotland might pass an assisted dying bill, which would be different. Don't debate the merits of this, but
no.
What would you expect a good UK government should be doing in the face of that? How would they choose to engage?
Yeah. It's a very good point. It's a very, very good point. So the bill is a private member's bill. It's being brought forward by an MSP, a Lib Dem MSP called Liam MacArthur, and I have had, maybe a year ago, I had my initial meeting with him to go through it, and I won't go into the merits or otherwise, but we have identified where the pitfalls might be, and we have helped him with that legislation. So that is a very good example of a unionist MSP wanting to work with us to get his legislation to the finishing line. And that would involve Section 104 orders, of which we have given many to amend UK government legislation to accommodate the devolved administration.
May I just come back to something?
Of course, sorry.
I'm detecting within this committee a slight feeling that perhaps UK government are not always showing the respect to the DAs, Senate in my case, that they merit. And I just want to push back a little bit and say that there needs to be reciprocity in all of our dealings. I feel that we are, and I've defended the position of the UK government in this, but we need to talk about actual examples. And my colleague made the point about the actions of the Scottish government during the COVID crisis. I can talk to you of what happened in Wales, where we made sure, obviously at national level, that the Welsh government was represented, rightly so, at all COBRA meetings. It didn't matter whether we were discussing things that were devolved or things that were reserved. They were there in the room or sometimes on the screen so that they knew exactly what the UK government was doing. And I sat in a few, though not many, of those meetings when the Secretary of State was elsewhere. I was the junior minister at the time. Similarly, I did a lot of the IMGs and the other forum for ministerial collaboration. And obviously I was representing the UK government, but we discussed a range of issues. But we made sure that the Welsh government minister, who was usually, but not always, of course, Vaughan Gethin at that time, the health minister, was present. Sometimes as other ministers, depending on the nature of the discussion. I then, my Secretary of State then wrote to Welsh government and said, well, we'd also welcome knowing what's going on in Wales, what your thinking is, what you're doing, so that we can all work together and understand each other's positions. We weren't looking to make any kind of political capital out of any of this. And eventually, after some trying, I was invited to go to one meeting where ministers in the Welsh Government were discussing things, but only to stay for the parts of the meeting that related to reserve matters, which from memory, I think, were policing and the input of the army. So I felt quite strongly that there was an imbalance here, that I was invited graciously enough to go along to meetings of Welsh Government ministers who were discussing things with organisations that are reserved, i.e. police and army, but told that I would have to leave the meeting when discussions were taking place with the NHS. And I thought that was wrong, because there had been a spirit of openness shown by the UK government at the time. And it would have been outrageous if we turned round to the health minister in the Welsh government and said, I'm sorry, but you can't stay for this part of the COBRA meeting because we're going to discuss what we're doing with the army now. That would have been ludicrous, childish, outrageous, wrong, and we, of course, didn't do it. But that is exactly what was going on.
Well, that's an argument for you to engage, isn't it?
Indeed, but I felt, sir, that, my Lord, that we were engaging, but the engagement has to come from Welsh Government as well.
That's what we're talking about, a duty to engage.
Absolutely, a responsibility to engage, yes. Yes.
Just building on that, if I may, I think the committee is very alive to the point that you make, and in fact the duty to engage was presented to you as a way of perhaps ensuring that the devolved administrations played their part in engaging. What interested me was to hear the Secretary of State for Scotland say it wouldn't really work in Scotland because we have an administration that is not a unionist administration. Things will get better, we hope, when unionist administration is in power. In Wales, your position is rather different. You have a unionist administration, but I'm hearing very similar frustrations So I'm just asking, is your view the same as the view that Mr. Jack expressed, which is that there really would be no point in having such a duty because it's simply going to be ignored by politically opposed devolved administrations?
I don't think we can lay down legislation. I mean, I hope that we never face a crisis of the sort that we did during COVID ever again in my lifetime or beyond. So I'm not arguing that we can't really legislate for these sorts of situations. I just feel that there ought to be a responsibility on all Senate members and MPs to understand that when a crisis of this nature happens, it's in everyone's interest for everyone to have as much information as possible as to what the other parties are doing.
You need goodwill, but you can't build it by writing it down.
I think that's very fair.
Similarly with the Tata problem, surely you would think there's a duty for both sides to engage in finding a solution.
Yeah, but I think there has been
I know there has been, but supposing there weren't, supposing one said, well,
on the Tata situation, there has been. I've no criticism at all. I have some criticisms over what happened during COVID, but in fairness, I think there's been good collaboration at the transition board. There are two aspects of what's going on with Tata. One is the decision to close the blast furnace and the need to support an electric arc furnace. That has been entirely done by UK government because UK government have put the money up, £500 million towards it. The second part of it is how do we support the wider community? And on that point, there's been a huge amount of collaboration, close working between UK government and Welsh government ministers. So I want to make clear, on that particular issue, I have absolutely no criticism of Welsh government at all. I have some criticisms of some of the politicians and political statements that have been made, but that's another matter which probably the committee won't want to hear about today.
Okay. I'm conscious you need to go, ministers. I just want to answer the reciprocity point. I mean, this is a second report. We did the first, respect and cooperation. We do accept the principle of reciprocity. But as three ministers coming here, we're testing with you what your view is and how you participate in the governance. But it doesn't mean we don't understand the importance of reciprocity.
I just wanted to pick up, from the COVID crisis. One of the problems facing the UK government there, and it faces them on many other occasions, is that the UK government has to speak for England and for the United Kingdom. Now that creates a problem, and that's because devolution is unfinished and unbalanced. Now, do you agree that the main problem is a democratic deficit in England, and something needs to be done? Now, David's already spoken about the mayors, but we've got papers about a whole scheme of regional assemblies in England. Isn't it about time that we did something to help get rid of the democratic deficit in England?
Well, I think Lord Fuchs, you make a very, very good point. And if we go back to the situation with COVID, I think it would be very helpful if, God forbid, something like that happens again, that we make sure that the elected mayors are just as involved as the First Ministers. And I think we have to think about it. It's not really my role to do that as Secretary of State for Wales, but perhaps the committee might want to consider how do we ensure that the Mayor of London, Liverpool, Manchester, Teesside, these mayors have enormous powers, enormous responsibilities, and surely should be included in all of the interministerial groups in the same way that the leaders of the devolved administrations are. Not perhaps a matter for me, but
it does leave out bits of England, though, because they only cover parts of England. It would need to be looked at in a rather more comprehensive way, wouldn't it?
Again, I think, Lord Fuchs, you make a good and interesting point, but it's probably not one for me as Secretary of State for Wales necessarily to opine on.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have time now, but when we exchange on notes, on the Section 35 exercise on the Gender Recognition Bill, I know from previous discussion we'd like a little bit of understanding about the protocol around engagement before exercising that. You probably don't have time to deal with it today because it's novel, so we don't have a sense of...
No, I mean, yes, no, there's the protocols on Section 35 and Section 33 are laid out in the Scotland Act, and I mean, Lord Keane could talk to you on this subject. He certainly has unofficially advised me and officially advised me in the past on it. But it's very simple. I mean, if you look at what happened with the Section 35, was the Gender Recognition Bill between, I think, November and December, going to the 22nd of December, there were many, many clauses that could have been adopted that would have changed the outcome. So we got to Christmas, and then we had, from the 22nd of December to, I think it was a certain number of working days, but the 17th of January, from memory, was my cut-off, where it either went for royal assent or it didn't. And that's the period, Chair, when I get my legal advice, because that's when the bill has passed. So the process happens between the legislation being passed in the Scottish Parliament. And when I refer to the finishing line for the assisted dying, it's not my opinion on assisted dying is irrelevant. The point is we were giving advice as requested to the bill provider to get it into the Parliament in fit shape. That's what I mean. That to me, as far as I'm concerned, is the finishing line. And we have always given advice when asked for the Office of the Advocate General for Scotland to the Scottish Government law officers as and when they need it. I mean, and there is a lot of collaboration between the legal department in the Scottish Government and the Office for the Advocate General. But my role comes into Section 35 is the legal advice I get after the bill passes, and I have to make that decision based on the advice I'm given before to say it either goes for royal assent or it doesn't. And I follow. We never say what our legal advice is or we followed it, but I did. Believe me, I did the right thing. And the Supreme Court, you can read all about it. They agreed with me.
Okay, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to put that on the record. Thank you very much. Well, I do want to thank you very much indeed, especially all three of you coming at the same time. We've taken more time than I think you probably had, but it's appreciated, and we'll exchange on this consultation point and delegated legislation, Henry VIII powers. But thank you very much indeed. It's most appreciated.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll now end the public session.